Hi friends, you are welcome in this tutorial. Friends, in this video we are going to discuss about a very famous romantic poet, but our discussion will be based on that poet's critical opinions, or we will think about that person as a critic. So this video will explore the person, a great literary person whose words are worth to discuss here, and the very name of that person is William Wordsworth. So friend, this video will discuss William Wordsworth's contribution as a critic, because when William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge published Lyrical Ballads in 1798, the new age, the new era began in English literature, and that era is called as Romantic period or the Romantic age, dated as 1798 to 1832. So we find that there is a great contribution of William Wordsworth as a critic, and this video will focus on his contribution as a critic. He composed a very great treatise called Preface to Lyrical Ballads in 1800, and this treatise has become his only and major book of criticism, or in which we can say that his critical opinions are formed. So our discussion will be revolved around Preface to Lyrical Ballads, which is published in 1800, and later the same has been revised and enlarged in 1802 and 1815. So here we will talk about first this Preface to Lyrical Ballads. And friends, this preface is comprised of 40 paragraphs, and we can divide these paragraphs into some parts so that we can understand the very matter or what is there in particular paragraph. So we can divide this preface into four major parts comprising of various paragraphs. For example, here we have the very first part, which comprised of 1 to 12 paragraph, and in these paragraphs William Wordsworth talks about why did he compose this treatise, preface. Then he talks about the language of poetry, subject matter of poetry, nature of poetry, some of the features of poetry, and he also talks about prose and verse in the paragraph 1 to 12. Then next division we have paragraph 13 to 21, in which he defines poetry. Then he talks about qualities of poet. Then he talks about function and objectives of poet. Friends, third part here we have paragraph next two paragraphs, or paragraph 22 and 23 is devoted to meter in poetry. What kind of meter should be there in the poetry, or what is the role of meter in poetry. Then friends, we have next part, that is paragraph 24 to 32, and in these paragraphs he redefines poetry. He again talks about the very nature of poetry, the pleasure of poetry, or what kind of pleasure poetry gives readers. So these things are discussed in this section. And the last section here we can say that paragraph 33 to 40 is devoted to an appendix, and this appendix is based on the diction of poetry, or diction used in the poetry. So this is the very explanation or parts of his preface to Lyrical Ballads. Friends, now let's start this Lyrical Ballads and the very opinions of William Wordsworth in detail. So the very need of the public, or the very need of the audience in neoclassical period or romantic period is recognized by William Wordsworth and some of his fellow poets. For example, we have S.T. Coleridge, who is his friend. Then we have Shelley, Keats and others, and these poets have expanded the very scope of poetry. We find that poetry is stuck in the drawing rooms of neoclassical period, but these poets or the romantics have brought this poetry into the very public. They have made it open to all, and they have derived this poetry in the very rustic life. We find that the scope is expanded, the scope is enlarged in this way. Now friends, let's talk about the different points he discusses in Preface to Lyrical Ballads. And the very first point is purpose of writing of this preface. Why did Wordsworth write this preface to Lyrical Ballads? So there are some reasons. The very first reason is that many neoclassical critics have criticized the poems which are published in Lyrical Ballads. Actually there are 23 poems, and most of the poems were composed by William Wordsworth, and some poems was written by his friend S.T. Coleridge, and these poems are criticized by neoclassical critics. And the very point of their criticism was the subject, language and diction used in poetry. And Wordsworth wanted to give answer to these critics, and hence he composed Preface to Lyrical Ballads. There is next reason of publishing this preface. He wanted to show people what does poetry convey, or what is the subject matter of poetry, or why a poet writes poetry. So he wanted to answer these questions. So this is one of the reasons. Again, we find his opinion that poetry is the truthful representation of nature. As we can say that many romantic poets are very conscious about nature, and all the time they talks about nature in their literary works. William Wordsworth also has given more significance to nature, and he wanted to show the relationship of nature, poetry and human beings. This is one of the reasons we can say that. Friends, so these are some of the reasons in composition of very preface to lyrical ballads. It is discussed in the very first part, paragraph 1 to 12, as we have seen before. The next point here is features of good poetry. Now, in the course of this preface, he talks about various features of poetry. The very first feature he talks about is close relation between subject and emotions. According to William Wordsworth, there is close relationship between subject and emotions. So emotions are conveyed through a particular subject, as it is stated in the very preface. Then the next thing is that romantic poets or William Wordsworth gives emphasis on the emotions. According to William Wordsworth, that poetry should excite emotions, and a poet should share his experience of emotions with the readers or with the audience. So this is the very second feature of poetry he talks. Then we have next feature, that feelings in relation with the action or situation it arouses. Now feelings are not isolated. Feelings have its relation with the very situation, with the subject matter, and with the situation or action it arouses, and it arouses a particular kind of action or situation when a poet shares his feeling or his emotions. So this is one of the features. Again, the next feature he talks about is poetry is an honest attempt of a poet to impart the experience he or she had in the composition of poetry. So a poet should, or poetry should, share the experience of emotions with the readers. So here we have last feature of poetry or a good poetry or a good poet, that it should correct the taste of readers. It should enlarge the capacity of readers. It should widen the scope of emotions which are felt by readers. So this is one of the features. So friend, these are some of the features. Now next point is, what is the subject matter of poetry, or what should be the subject matter of poetry according to William Wordsworth? If we analyze Wordsworth's poetry, or if we analyze the romantic literature, we find that all the romantic poets or Wordsworth has included rustic life as the subject. We find nature in their poetry. We find very simple and humble setting in their poetry or in their literature. So friends, why did Wordsworth choose rustic life as his subject matter in composition of poetry? He has given some of the reasons. The very first reason is that he says that the very real feelings find its expression in rustic life, finds its expression in humble, natural surroundings or rustic surroundings. The second reason he gives that the basic feelings exist in simplicity, and it should be included in poetry, the very basic or simple kind of feelings, and not the sophisticated or artificial life in cities. So we find that all the time these poets talks about nature and the things around nature, and they have neglected the very city life, and according to them that the real feelings does not include in city life or the sophisticated or artificial life. For that you have to go rustic life, you have to go in the nature, you have to find the natural things around you. So this is one of the reasons. The next reason according to Wordsworth is that the rustic life is close to nature, and they derive their models from nature. Most of the things we find in rustic life which are came from nature. So nature is the model for rustic people, for common men, or the men who lives in rural area or the rustic land. So this is the features.